Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
After the divorce, the mother-in-law brought a notary to her daughter-in-law and asked her to sign the documents. But the daughter-in-law just smirked and pulled out a will. "Are you sure you need this job?" Mrs. Spencer asked anxiously. She loved her daughter dearly and always worried about her life, like any normal mother. "Mom, I find it interesting," Rachel replied, embracing her mother. "My dear girl," Mrs. Spencer continued, "is a travel agency really your dream? You know geography was my favorite subject. I dream of traveling the world, and working in a travel agency will bring me closer to that dream," Rachel dreamily replied. "Sending people on trips and traveling yourself are different things," Mrs. Spencer sighed, "and besides, you won't earn much more money there." "Mom, what money? I'll be helping people skillfully organize their vacations. And I'll have enough money, trust me." "You're always the same," Mrs. Spencer waved her hand at her daughter. "And what will you live on? Or are you waiting for your Prince Charming? What kind of daughter have I raised?" "Certainly not one like you," Rachel laughed. "You're down to earth." "And what's wrong with that?" her mother protested. "Yes, I believe a person should provide for themselves decently to live comfortably. And you're pushing yourself towards a modest life. And how do you plan to travel then?" "Let me figure out my own life," Rachel replied somewhat sharply. After all, every parent should support their child. And every parent should protect their child from unnecessary mistakes. Mrs. Spencer looked affectionately at her daughter. "Think about that." "I will. I'll sit down and start thinking right now," Rachel said mockingly. "Stop being sarcastic," Mrs. Spencer raised her voice. "I care about her, and she's mocking me." "Mommy," Rachel approached her mother and hugged her from behind, "I love you. You're saying everything right, but I have my own opinion. Let me make mistakes and then draw conclusions. What am I here for then?" Mrs. Spencer looked at her daughter with sad eyes. "To help you avoid those mistakes. But you've made mistakes in your life too, and you learned from them. So let me learn from my own mistakes," Rachel pleaded. "Well, my dear," Mrs. Spencer gently placed her hands on her daughter's face. "I don't want to argue with you. Do as you see fit." "Thank you," Rachel kissed her mom, "but I'll know you're always there. It's a pity Dad isn't here." After these words, Mrs. Spencer grew sad, remembering her husband who passed away a year ago. The woman had a hard time coping with this loss. She was emotionally very attached to her husband. His sudden death was a blow to Mrs. Spencer. She lived for him, not noticing other men around her, and now, with him gone, she still saw no one around, living with her old memories. She woke up with his image in her mind and fell asleep with thoughts of him. If it weren't for Rachel, she would have gone mad from the pain that completely consumed her. Her daughter tried to envelop her with constant care. She walked with her mother around the city every day, and in the evenings, she held home movie nights for her mom. But despite this, Mrs. Spencer found moments for her sorrow. When Rachel wasn't home, the woman would take out the family photo album and carefully examine it, not missing the smallest details. 20 happiest years, Mrs. Spencer sighed over her husband's photograph and ran her graceful fingers over the picture, as if trying to touch him. Her favorite photo of him was the one where he stood in his military uniform. In her personal opinion, he looked very handsome and noble in it. Mrs. Spencer often reminisced about how for these 20 years, she and Rachel traveled around the garrisons following Eric Spencer. They visited different cities in our vast country. Mrs. Spencer understood where her daughter's passion for travel came from, but she wanted to keep her daughter close. She realized it was wrong, that Rachel should have her own life, rich and interesting, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The prospect of loneliness was killing her. "Mom," Rachel interrupted her reminiscing, "what are you thinking about?" "As always," Mrs. Spencer sadly replied. "Thinking about Dad again?" Rachel asked anxiously. She was worried about her mom, seeing how hard it was for her. "I'm sorry for reminding you of him." "Oh, darling," Mrs. Spencer smiled, "you're not to blame. I just can't seem to learn to live without him." But you have me, Rachel approached her mother, adjusted a strand of her hair. And I also always remember Dad, and I'm also very sorry that he's no longer with us. Rachel remembered how a little over a year ago they received a call from the hospital informing them that Mr. Spencer had suffered a massive heart attack. The doctors fought for his life until the end, but they couldn't save him. At that moment, their home was filled with darkness and sorrow. Mrs. Spencer screamed, fell unconscious. The ambulance arrived quickly, telling Rachel that her mom had had a stroke. Rachel still remembered the feeling of hopelessness. She was very afraid of losing her mom too. She visited all the churches, lit candles for her beloved mother's health. She couldn't close her eyes, constantly thinking about her, and prayed for her all the time. When her mom was discharged, they immediately went to the cemetery, as Mrs. Spencer didn't attend the funeral. She couldn't even say goodbye to her husband. Rachel sometimes recalled all this, but more often it haunted her dreams, the soul-tearing cry of her mother and her sense of pain and irreparable loss. Over time, Rachel's soul pain began to subside. The girl began to embrace life fully, but she noticed how this pain continued to torment her mom. And you know what I realized? He will always remain in our memory, and also, Rachel looked intently at her mother, he would be very disappointed to see you like this. Why is that? Mrs. Spencer was surprised. Because life must go on. Do you think he would be happy to see you falling apart? How else? Mrs. Spencer sat down on the couch and, covering her face with her hands, began to cry. Rachel sat down next to her, rested her head on her shoulder. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. And so, in complete silence and in unison, they sat and cried for about 10 minutes, until Rachel glanced at the clock hanging on the wall. "Oh!" exclaimed Rachel. "I'm already late for the interview." "Looks like we've completely fallen apart," Mrs. Spencer wiped her cheeks. "Go wash up and get ready." Rachel rushed to the bathroom to freshen up. Mrs. Spencer prepared the dress she was going to wear. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Spencer called out, "the dress is ready." "Thank you so much." Rachel dashed into the room. "I would have been late otherwise." "Good luck," Mrs. Spencer called after her fleeing daughter. 15 minutes later, Rachel got off the bus and headed to the address she had written down on a piece of paper. It was a hot spring day outside, the sun was blazing. Nature was blooming around, filling the earth with its beauty, but Rachel didn't notice any of it. She briskly walked toward her dream. "Good afternoon," she entered the travel agency office and greeted the girl sitting behind the desk. "I'm here for an interview." "What's your name?" the girl asked. "I'm Rachel," she introduced herself. "Please, have a seat," the girl requested. "Mr. Morris is currently busy." "Shouldn't have rushed," Rachel muttered quietly and sat down. "What did you say?" The girl looked at her questioningly. "Oh, nothing, just thinking out loud," Rachel smiled and felt the awkwardness of the moment. "Wait here," the girl said seriously and stared at the computer screen. Rachel decided not to waste time. She started exploring the office. There were many photographs from different countries on the office walls. Also, there were shelves with various figurines and other knickknacks. The longest wall had a world map stickered on it, so colorful and detailed that Rachel couldn't resist and walked up to it. "It's so well thought out here," she said aloud. The stranger smirked and continued her work. Suddenly, the door to the office opened, and two men came out. Rachel glanced in their direction. One of them was a tall brunette in a business suit, and the other was a short man in sportswear. Which one of them is Mr. Morris? Rachel wondered. "We wish you a pleasant and unforgettable vacation," said the man in the suit. "Now it's clear who," flashed through Rachel's mind. "Mr. Morris," the girl from behind the desk suddenly stood up, "someone came for an interview with you." The man looked at Rachel with an assessing gaze, then shifted his gaze to the girl. "Let her in," he said. "Please come in," the girl offered Rachel. Rachel entered the office, looking around. Diplomas and thank you letters hung on the walls. "My name is Arnold Morris," the man started the interview. I am the director of this travel agency and also its owner. What's your name? I'm Rachel. The girl sat down. Rachel, why did you decide to work in this field? The man asked. I spent my entire childhood traveling to different cities with my father, she began to explain, and I loved geography in school. Why were you traveling to different cities? He inquired. Well, my father was in the military, and my mom and I, like his family, had to go with him. Mr. Morris smirked. As far as I know, there are no former military. He passed away a year ago. Rachel sadly lowered her eyes. Pardon my tactlessness, he apologized. It's okay, you didn't know. I understand this will be your first job? Mr. Morris clarified. Yes, I really hope I'm suitable for you. The girl's eyes lit up with joy. What can you tell me about tourism? The man asked. Tourism is the recreation of a person who wants to gain new experiences and emotions, Rachel began, and a travel agency helps such people skillfully organize their vacation. Well, all right, Mr. Morris continued. Tell me, how many continents are there on our planet and which of them are interesting for tourism? Typically, 6 continents are distinguished. Rachel began her response as if she were back in school: Eurasia, Africa, South America, North America, Australia, and Antarctica. Most people prefer to travel in Europe, but each year there is an increasing influx of tourists to Africa. People also travel to North and South America and to Australia. Antarctica also has its demand, but here the demand is much lower, let's say, for enthusiasts. So you're saying that all continents are suitable for tourism? Mr. Morris looked meaningfully at her. Yes, Rachel answered uncertainly. Well, why so uncertainly? You need to speak confidently, then the client will trust you more as a professional. Okay, I'll definitely keep that in mind, Rachel said more confidently. That's better already, the man smiled. Rachel, let me tell you straight. I want to change employees, so I'm conducting interviews with candidates for the manager position today. I have several more interviews today. Fill out the form with Helen, and I'll get in touch with you. Thank you. Rachel left the office and approached the girl. Helen, I need a form to fill out. Here, take it. The girl handed her the sheet and pen. Oh, are you leaving? Rachel asked. Yes, why? Helen asked discontentedly. Why are you leaving, if it's not a secret? Rachel continued to inquire. Who knows what my boss didn't like? Helen burst out and shrugged. And I didn't like your lack of interest in this job. Mr. Morris came out of the office, having heard everything. You need to be enthusiastic about this field, not just sit idly by and occupy someone else's place. Rachel was slightly frightened by his somewhat rude voice, and Helen sat there as if nothing had happened, not even reacting to his words. Mr. Morris bid farewell to Rachel and returned to his office. Stern boss? Rachel whispered. It depends. In a word, he's temperamental, Helen smirked. Rachel filled out the form, handed it to Helen, and left. On her way home, she started examining the buds swelling on the trees, and some had even sprouted green leaves. It seemed to her that along with spring, she was blossoming too. Everything around inspired her with dreams and contemplation, and Rachel began to imagine herself working at the travel agency, becoming an indispensable person whom everyone would turn to make their vacations unforgettable. She immersed herself deeply in her fantasies and didn't notice how she reached home. You're so mysterious, her mother interrupted her from her reverie. Did you get the job? Not yet. They said they'll call, Rachel replied. Then they won't call, sighed Mrs. Spencer. Why do you think so? Rachel was surprised. Usually they say that to avoid hurting feelings and creating an awkward moment, her mother replied. But that's not the case. They told me there are several more candidates. They'll see everyone and then call, Rachel insisted. God willing, said Mrs. Spencer. You'll see, they'll hire me for this job, Rachel exclaimed and twirled around. Mrs. Spencer looked at her daughter. She liked her lightness, openness, positivity, and the ability to find something good in every detail. She wasn't like that herself, but next to her daughter, it was easier for her. She made her life better. "Let's go home," Mrs. Spencer said calmly. "Mom, why home?" Rachel tugged at her hand. "The weather is wonderful. Let's go for a walk." "Haven't you walked enough?" Mrs. Spencer objected and shrugged off Rachel's hand. "Let's go to the lake," Rachel unexpectedly suggested. "We'll stop by the store on the way, buy some bread rolls for the ducks, and feed them." "Ducks?" Mrs. Spencer laughed. "Do you think they're hungry?" "I'm just sure they are," Rachel replied with a smile. "And they're sitting there, waiting for us to come and feed them." "You're so caring." Mrs. Spencer approached her daughter, affectionately stroking her cheek. "All right, let's go feed them." They walked along the road to the lake, chatting about trivial matters. Rachel admired the awakening of spring in its various manifestations all the way. She kept running up to different trees, hugging them, enjoying the spring woodsy scent. When she spotted some small yellow dandelions along the way, she immediately picked them and made a small bouquet, tying them with a red string that was hanging from her wrist. "Here, Mom, this bouquet is for you." Rachel ran up to her mother and handed her the flowers. "How sweet," the woman smiled, but when she saw the red string, the smile disappeared from her face. She abruptly took her daughter's left hand and looked at her. "Why?" "Why what?" Rachel didn't understand. "Why did you take off your string bracelet?" "You tied it to make a wish," Mrs. Spencer said sadly, "and the wish hasn't come true yet." "I don't know how to explain, but I'm sure I'll get this job," Rachel tried to explain, "so I took it off. I don't need it anymore. I wish I had your confidence." Mrs. Spencer brought the bouquet to her face and inhaled its scent. It seemed to her that it contained everything: the sunshine, the blue sky, and even spring itself. "I love you very much." "And I love you," Rachel shouted to the whole park, causing even passers-by to turn and smile. "Stop shouting, people are looking at us," Mrs. Spencer reproached her. "Let them look, especially since they're smiling now, which means they feel good too." They reached the lake, started feeding the ducks, feeling some satisfaction from their help. The ducks immediately swam up to them, trying to eat everything, not leaving even a crumb. "Look how cute they are," Rachel pointed to the ducks. "It wasn't in vain that we came. The connection between humans and nature is something inexplicable, something intangible. And you're a philosopher on top of everything." Mrs. Spencer laughed. A future travel agency manager and a philosopher in one, Rachel laughed back and heard the sound of her mobile phone in her bag. She frantically started searching for the phone in her bag, knowing that they might be calling from work. "Yes, I'm listening," she answered the incoming call. "No, thank you." "Who was calling?" Mrs. Spencer asked. "Some bank, offering a loan," Rachel sighed disappointedly. She had been waiting for Mr. Morris's call, but he still hadn't called. "Let's go home." "But we just got here," Mrs. Spencer asked in annoyance. "What about the connection between humans and nature?" "I've had enough of nature," Rachel replied. Rachel grabbed her bag and headed towards home. "Wait for me," Mrs. Spencer ran after her daughter. She understood these sudden mood swings perfectly well. They were familiar to her, as she reacted the same way when she was eagerly awaiting something, but it just wouldn't happen. They walked home in silence. Mrs. Spencer tried to start a conversation with her daughter a couple of times, but to no avail. Rachel was no longer paying any attention to nature. She was lost in her thoughts, and judging by her expression, those thoughts were gloomy. "Sweetheart, let's have dinner," Rachel's mom called in the evening. "I'm not hungry." Rachel lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. "This won't do," Mrs. Spencer said disappointedly. "I understand everything, but it's too early to draw any conclusions. They might call you tomorrow. And how will you work if you're not well rested?" "I don't want to eat," Rachel replied irritably. "Leave me alone." Mrs. Spencer didn't say anything else. She gently closed the door to the room and went to have dinner alone, while Rachel continued to lie on the bed. The sound of her mobile phone distracted her from negative thoughts, and she grabbed it. Yes, a smile appeared on her face. Tomorrow? At what time? All right. I'll definitely come. The girl rushed out of the room and casually walked into the kitchen. A smile never left her face. What's for dinner? Rachel sat down at the table. Mrs. Spencer looked at her contented daughter and realized that she had received the call she had been waiting for, and judging by her expression, the call was more than successful. So, you got the job, Mrs. Spencer said quietly, holding a cup of tea in her hands. Yes. Rachel joyfully shouted and ran to hug her mom. Quiet. Mrs. Spencer shouted as the sudden tight hug caused her to spill hot coffee on herself. Oh, sorry, Mom. Rachel led her to the sink and started pouring cold water over the burnt spot. Is it better now? Yes, but your news is giving me a hard time, Mrs. Spencer joked. Congratulations. Thank you, thank you. Rachel began to shower her mom with kisses. I'm so happy. How little you need for happiness, Mrs. Spencer smiled. No, Rachel said, I need a lot for complete happiness, and this is just the beginning of happiness. What do you need for complete happiness? Her mom asked. For you to be alive and healthy, Rachel kissed her mom, and also to find true love and travel the world with him. And what is true love like? Mrs. Spencer was terribly curious to hear her daughter's opinion on this matter. I think it's like yours with Dad, Rachel replied thoughtfully, always together and with the same interests. Well, then I wish you, my girl, to find your true love. Mrs. Spencer hugged her daughter and buried her face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent. The next day, Rachel went to work in a great mood. She deliberately left early to avoid being late on her first day of work, and at the same time, to leisurely walk and enjoy the fresh spring air. Nature was still blooming, delighting with its fresh green color. Birds were chirping around, rejoicing in the arrival of spring, and people already looked somehow different, happier somehow. Rachel slowly walked along the road, observing all this beauty. There was a spring warmth in her soul. Happiness filled every cell of her being. Dreaming about her future, she didn't notice how she approached the office, which turned out to be closed. Strange, she thought, but there was nothing to do but wait. There were still 15 minutes before the start of the workday, so Rachel decided to buy ice cream from the nearby store. Just as she began to unwrap the ice cream, anticipating its sweet cold taste, a black car pulled up, and Mr. Morris stepped out of it. Good morning, she said to the man. And to you, good morning, Mr. Morris replied. Why did you throw away the ice cream? The man looked at her intently, and Rachel's legs trembled with fear. You don't need to be afraid of me, he softened his tone. I don't bite. Rachel smiled and followed the director into the office. Here's your workspace, he pointed to the desk in the office. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll train you later. Okay, Rachel said timidly. Be more confident, Rachel, the man added and went into his office. Why am I so lost? The girl scolded herself quietly. She sat down at the desk, turned on the computer, and began to look at the folders on the desktop. There were many of them. Rachel understood one thing: there was an individual folder for each country. Her interest grew with each passing minute, and she began to open the folders and examine their contents. So, are you getting settled in? Mr. Morris came out of his office. I'll tell you everything now. The man sat down next to her and began to explain in detail to Rachel what was where and the purpose of each folder. He was so engrossed in explaining everything that Rachel caught herself wanting to devote herself wholeheartedly to this work. Mr. Morris saw how interested Rachel was in listening to him. He was pleased that this time he hadn't made a mistake in choosing a candidate. Rachel asked many questions, receiving a detailed answer to each of them. They didn't even notice when it was time for lunch. We need to take a break, Mr. Morris interrupted the training. Did you bring lunch? No, Rachel was flustered, completely forgetting about having lunch at work. Well then, let's go. Mr. Morris smiled and got up from the table. Where to? Rachel asked shyly. She wasn't ready for such a turn of events. To the cafe nearby. I always have lunch there. I don't have any money. Rachel felt very uncomfortable. Did I ask you for money? Mr. Morris smirked. The company treats. Rachel followed the director. The man opened the car door for her. After you, he smiled and extended his hand to the girl. Rachel was amazed by his gallantry. She had never met such courteous men before, except for her dad, of course. She sat down on the brown leather seat. The car's interior was filled with the scent of novelty. Rachel felt important in the salon of such a luxurious car. She couldn't help but smile from pleasure, unaware of it herself. Did something amuse you? Mr. Morris was surprised. No, not at all, Rachel blushed. I've just never ridden in such a car in my life. You always have to strive for the best, he said mysteriously. They reached the cafe in 5 minutes. It really wasn't far away. We could have walked, Rachel concluded. You're right, we'll walk tomorrow. Mr. Morris opened the door for her and let her in. Choose whatever you want, he offered, taking the menu. Rachel looked at the variety of dishes on the menu, her eyes darting around. She didn't know what to choose specifically. If you could, Rachel looked at him gratefully. The man placed the order himself. While the order was being prepared, Mr. Morris started asking Rachel about her life. Rachel, tell me, how do you imagine your future? I imagine it like this, Rachel said dreamily. I'll work at your company, gain experience, earn a decent amount of money, and then I want to travel the world, like you. How do you think? The man smiled. I travel for the advancement of my business. Do you also plan to open your own business in the future? Oh no, Rachel replied embarrassedly, that requires a lot of money. And do you think traveling requires little money? Well, I imagine it takes quite a bit. I'll save up, Rachel said hopefully. You don't plan to live off your mother forever, do you? The man inquired. Well, Rachel hesitated, I don't intend to completely rely on her financially. Just. Life is so simple for your generation, Mr. Morris interrupted her. Okay, let's have lunch. The waiter is already bringing our dishes. They had lunch in silence. Rachel felt very awkward in the presence of the director. She was very afraid of questions from him. Mr. Morris decided not to embarrass the girl with any more questions and opted for a pause. Well, it's time to get back to work, he stood up from the table. Yes, of course, Rachel agreed and also got up. Forward, to new achievements. The man said demonstratively. For 3 whole months, Rachel diligently performed her duties at her new job. Arnold Morris was very pleased with her. A week ago, he went on a business trip to Thailand. A new hotel opened there, and Mr. Morris decided to review it for his agency. Rachel stayed in the office as the head. She carefully studied the upcoming tours, told the arriving clients about them, and asked about their preferences. And on the eve of the director's arrival at the firm, a young man of average height came in, entering the office as if it were his own home. Well, hello, he approached Rachel casually. And you're nothing special. The previous one was amazing. Rachel looked at this dark-haired, cheeky guy and couldn't understand what he actually wanted. Who are you? And what do you need? Rachel was outraged. Who am I? The guy laughed. The boss needs to know everyone's face. My immediate boss is Mr. Morris, the girl stated, and you don't look anything like him. Stop wrinkling your nose. The young man took a pencil from the table and flicked it on Rachel's nose. Stop it immediately. Rachel jumped up. Who gave you the right to treat me like this? Oh, come on, the guy smirked. Such a feisty one. I don't know who you are, and I don't know what you want, but I ask you to leave this office," Rachel demanded. The young man took a sheet of paper from the table, crumpled it, and threw it at the girl's face. "Oh, get lost," he said and left. Poor Rachel cried with frustration. She couldn't believe such people existed. She spent the whole day recovering from such an unpleasant encounter. The next day, Mr. Morris arrived, entering the office. He looked relaxed, carefree. Rachel was very glad to see him. "So, how was your trip?" Rachel asked curiously. "Excellent. Thailand is a celebration," Mr. Morris began to tell. "A country of culinary delights and shopping. And how about the new hotel?" "Not bad. By Thai standards, it's worth 4 stars, the man continued. "We'll offer it to our clients. Here are the photos and a video review." Mr. Morris handed Rachel a flash drive, and she immediately inserted it into the computer. "Go ahead, familiarize yourself with the material. If you have any questions, I'll be in my office." Mr. Morris headed to his office, but suddenly the entrance door opened, and a woman entered, followed by the young man from yesterday. "You again," Rachel protested. "And why did you come?" The director addressed the visitors. "Hello, my dear," the woman approached the director and kissed him. "I couldn't wait for you to come home. So, we decided to come to you here." "I would have come home myself in the evening," Mr. Morris said calmly. "There was no need to come to my workplace." "Hi, Dad," the young man approached the man, stood next to him, and looked at Rachel. "So, do we look alike now?" "Dad?" Rachel was taken aback. She didn't expect that. "I don't understand." Mr. Morris stood in bewilderment. "Do you two already know each other?" "Well, sort of," the guy smirked. "I dropped by yesterday, but I received an unfriendly reception. Well, Rachel tried to explain. "Did you rudely behave again?" Mr. Morris began to reprimand his son. "When will you come to your senses?" "Boys, let's not argue," the woman requested. "Let's not have a showdown in front of a stranger. Rachel, I want to apologize for my idiot, whatever he did there." Mr. Morris approached the girl. "He means no harm. He's just not very bright. Arnold, watch what you're saying." "He's still your son," the woman objected. "By the way, let me introduce you. This is Rachel, my new employee," he introduced the girl. "She's smart, educated." Oh yes, the woman sarcastically remarked and looked Rachel up and down. "And this is my family," the man continued the introduction. "My wife Mary and my son Dennis." "Mr. D. Morris," the guy clarified. "Isn't it too much honor to call you Mr.?" Arnold smirked. "You haven't earned it yet. Maybe you should be more lenient with your son," the woman suggested. "What son?" Mr. Morris exclaimed in surprise. "He's already a grown man, so he should be responsible for his actions and know how to communicate politely with other people." "And what are you suggesting to me?" Dennis protested. "Should I apologize to her again?" "Your memory is short, son. I told you her name is Rachel," the man said angrily. "Whether to apologize or not should be your decision. It all depends on your upbringing and your determination." "Well, sorry," Dennis grumbled, glancing briefly at Rachel. "Okay, I'm not offended," Rachel replied calmly. "Rachel, you're charming," Mr. Morris smiled. "How magnanimous of her," Mrs. Morris smirked. "Enough," the man snapped. "Stop this circus. Go home already. See you in the evening." "All right, let's go." The woman took her son's hand, and they left the office with their heads held high. "Apologize for them again," Mr. Morris softened. "My son is a spoiled egoist, and my wife indulges him, not realizing she's making things worse." "Is he studying?" Rachel asked. "No, he already got his diploma, but he doesn't seem to be in a hurry to work," the man replied disappointingly. "And your business doesn't interest him at all?" Rachel continued. He's only interested in the money from the business. He won't lift a finger to help, Mr. Morris sighed. I saw a similar situation in a movie once. A guy grew up in a wealthy family. He was so spoiled that he sponged off his parents' money and lived off of it. And you know what the parents did? What? Mr. Morris was interested. They decided to marry him off. They found a suitable girl who was smart and well-mannered, and they married him. And then what happened? The man looked at Rachel questioningly, curious about how it all ended. Then his wife started managing him. They had a child, and eventually, the guy fell in love with her. And they all lived happily ever after. The man laughed. Sounds like a fairy tale. Why a fairy tale? Rachel asked in amazement. Don't you think life can be like that? I think not, Mr. Morris replied seriously. Life is a bit more complicated. Have you ever thought why life is getting more complicated? The girl smiled. Mr. Morris became interested in Rachel's opinion. It's simple. We always complicate everything ourselves, the girl snapped her fingers. We need to live a little simpler. I'll definitely think about that, Mr. Morris chuckled and went back to his office. A year passed. Rachel continued to work at the travel agency, fully dedicated to her work. She often worked weekends, not because Mr. Morris asked her to, but because she wanted to. The tourism industry had captivated her in a positive sense. The girl became a true professional in her field. She could cover for the director on any issue. Mr. Morris greatly appreciated this about her and eventually gave her a raise. Rachel was pleased with this situation and tackled her work with even greater enthusiasm. Mrs. Spencer occasionally scolded her daughter for her overly zealous dedication. You're always disappearing at work, she complained. When do you plan to build your personal life? Mommy, what personal life? Rachel affectionately hugged her mother. I'm all about work. Maybe when I start traveling, I'll meet someone. Throughout the year, Mrs. Spencer periodically returned to this question, but the answer was always the same. Eventually, the woman resigned herself to a situation she couldn't influence. Mr. Morris's health had deteriorated significantly over the past year. He occasionally had to undergo examinations, and a couple of times, he even ended up hospitalized. Rachel saw the tense atmosphere developing in his family. Mrs. Morris often came to the office with new complaints, and Dennis even managed to have a quarrel with his father once, after which Rachel had to call an ambulance. You're not taking care of yourself, she said anxiously. If something happens to you, they'll sell the business of your life. Don't worry, Rachel, Mr. Morris replied gratefully. Everything will be fine. And so, on a beautiful warm autumn day, Mr. Morris came to work in a cheerful mood and with a bouquet of white roses. Rachel hadn't seen him so inspired in a long time. You're positively glowing with happiness, the girl smiled. Is there a celebration? Not exactly, he looked at her mysteriously and handed her the bouquet. This is for you. For me? Rachel was surprised. No one had given her flowers in a long time, and for the first time, it was the director. For what reason? I have a proposal for you, Mr. Morris said even more enigmatically. Let's go to the cafe. We'll discuss everything. You've got me intrigued. The girl was looking forward to something special. Thank you very much for the bouquet. I'm pleased. 15 minutes later, they were already sitting in the cafe and placing their orders. And another glass of champagne for us, Mr. Morris finished his order. But you're driving, Rachel reminded him. Then we'll walk back, he said cheerfully. So, what's the occasion? Rachel couldn't wait to find out everything. Not an occasion, but a proposal, Mr. Morris reminded her. But first, I'll ask you a few questions. I'm all ears, the girl settled comfortably. Do you have a boyfriend? Mr. Morris unexpectedly asked. I don't understand. Rachel said surprised. Are you asking about my personal life? Yes, exactly, he confirmed. I don't have anyone yet. And why do you need this information? Out of idle curiosity? Not at all, Mr. Morris continued. Then the next question. Do you want to manage our travel agency? Mr. Morris, you're scaring me, Rachel said cautiously. You have a wife, don't you? Ah. So that's why you became so scared, the man chuckled. You thought I was hinting at a close relationship? And what else should I have thought? The girl was confused. No, I'm not talking about myself, Mr. Morris continued. Remember a year ago when you told me the story about the spoiled boy whose parents then married him off? Well, yes, I remember. Rachel felt relieved and relaxed. So you decided to marry your son after all? Yes, the man replied affirmatively, looking intently at her. Rachel felt goosebumps all over her body from this gaze. And have you found a bride? She asked curiously. Found one, Mr. Morris replied, still looking at her. Why are you looking at me like that? Rachel began to guess the essence of what was happening. Are you hinting at me? Rachel, you're a wonderful person, smart, educated, and very ambitious, her boss began to praise her. Wait a minute, if I understand you correctly, you want to marry your dentist to me? Rachel couldn't believe her ears. Exactly, Mr. Morris nodded. I couldn't find a better candidate than you. And did you ask me? Do I need this? That's exactly what I'm asking. Do you want to manage the travel agency? So that's how you're framing the question, Rachel said disappointedly. She felt anger building up inside her. Do you think I can be bought? No, not at all. Mr. Morris was a little scared by her reaction. I'm offering a mutually beneficial cooperation. Really? And what does it consist of? Rachel raised her voice. You'll marry Dennis, tame my good-for-nothing son, and in return, you'll be able to fully manage the agency, even travel abroad instead of me. Don't you want to continue managing the agency anymore? Rachel asked. Why not? I want to, the man truthfully replied. But now we will manage it together. However, I'll be appearing in the office less often, so the maximum workload will fall on your shoulders. Did you think about it for a long time before making me this offer? Rachel sarcastically asked. The last 3 months, confessed Mr. Morris. I'm not rushing you. Think it over, and you'll make a decision tomorrow. I'll think about it, Rachel replied coldly. You don't have to come back to work today. Why? You have something to do today. Go home and think. The man took out his wallet, placed money for the waiter on the table, then stood up and left the establishment. Rachel sat in bewilderment for another 15 minutes. She felt like the main character in some soap opera. Will you be ordering anything else? The waiter's voice interrupted her thoughts. No, thank you. The girl got up and left. On the way home, she kept thinking about the director's proposal. In her head, she couldn't fit all the details of what was happening. She tried to distract herself with the beauties of autumn nature, its saturated colors, and the fresh rainy air, but she couldn't distract herself for long, and she plunged back into her thoughts. Why do you look so preoccupied? Her mother greeted her at home. What happened? I don't even know how to say this. Rachel lowered her gaze to the floor. What happened? Don't scare me, Mrs. Spencer was worried. The girl sat down on a puff in the hallway and grabbed her head with her hands. Rachel, honey, what happened? Her mother asked in fear. Don't just sit there, talk to me. Rachel couldn't hold back this information and told her mother everything in detail. Mrs. Spencer was shocked by what she heard, sat down next to her daughter, and started crying. Mom, that's enough. We need to think about what to do. Rachel came to her senses a little. What's there to think about? Mrs. Spencer shouted. Quit your job. Let them find another fool. Okay, the girl got up. Both of us need to relax and make a decision not based on emotions. I'll be back soon. Where are you going? Mrs. Spencer shouted after her departing daughter, but she didn't answer. 10 minutes later, Rachel returned home with a bottle of champagne and a large bar of dark chocolate. Here, she handed the bag with the purchases to her mother. "We're going to relax now." Mrs. Spencer took the bag and went to the kitchen. Rachel followed her. She opened the bottle of champagne, poured it into glasses. "I have a toast." She sat down at the table. "Let's toast to good sense." "It won't hurt us at all." Her mother sat down next to her. For 2 hours, they sat in the kitchen and discussed this topic, sometimes raising their voices. Each wanted to prove their point. In the end, they didn't agree on anything. "The champagne is finished, but the decision hasn't come," Rachel stated the fact. "I'm telling you, don't fall for the rich people's tricks. They can drag you into a swamp from which you won't be able to escape," Mrs. Spencer explained anxiously. "And I'm telling you, I've always dreamed of managing a travel agency, and a spouse is just a free addition." "How simple it is for you," her mother puzzled. "A spouse is just a free addition? And what's not simple then?" "Well, I'll marry him, I'll travel abroad. We won't see each other often, so everything works out fine for me. Besides, you yourself wanted me to have a personal life. But I wanted it to be for love." Mrs. Spencer was upset by her daughter's words. "And you? And what about me?" Rachel protested. "I see a goal and go for it. Maybe we'll love each other somehow later." "My girl, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Mrs. Spencer cried out of frustration. "Mom, please don't cry." Rachel approached her and started patting her back. She didn't like it when her mom cried. Her tears touched her to the core. "Please, calm down." "Oh, decide it yourself then." Mrs. Spencer wiped tears from her face, but they wouldn't stop. "You've heard my opinion, now think." Mrs. Spencer went to her room, and Rachel remained in the kitchen to think. She knew firmly that becoming the manager of the travel agency was a new level for her. But she wasn't eager to get married, especially to that narcissist Dennis. She sat in complete confusion, although deep down, the answer to the question had already matured. She just wasn't ready to admit it to herself yet. Rachel fell asleep towards dawn. Constant thoughts and pondering the situation kept her from sleeping. "Good morning, sweetheart," her mom woke her up with a gentle voice. "Good morning to you too." Rachel opened her eyes and smiled. "Let's go have breakfast. I made us coffee just the way you like it." "I'm coming." The girl got out of bed and went to wash up. "So, where's my coffee?" She entered the kitchen after her morning routine. "Sit down, my dear." Mrs. Spencer pushed a plate of pancakes towards her. "And pancakes too." Rachel reached out. "You're spoiling me today." "Well, can't I pamper my child sometimes?" Her mom smiled and took a sip of coffee. "I don't mind." Rachel started tasting the pancakes. "How delicious." "Thank you, I'm glad to hear that." Mrs. Spencer was pleased that she pleased her daughter. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Rachel noticed her mother's intense gaze. "I understand, you want to know my decision?" "No, not at all. I just like how you eat pancakes." "Mom, let's be honest." Rachel pushed the food aside. "Do you need an answer from me?" "No," the woman replied confidently. "I'll accept any decision you make. After all, it's your life." "And do you not want to know my decision now?" Rachel asked animatedly. "Why?" Mrs. Spencer added. "If you decide to get married, I'll find out anyway, or won't you invite me to the wedding?" "Let's not rush things," Rachel winked. "Let everything happen in its own time." Rachel finished her breakfast, kissed her mom, and went to work. On the way, she continued to contemplate her decision, weighing all the pros and cons. She clearly realized that her life would change dramatically in the near future. "Good morning," she greeted her boss, who was already standing at her desk, eagerly awaiting her arrival. "Good morning," Mr. Morris politely replied. "How are we doing?" "Are we, or is it just me?" Rachel clarified. "It's a joint affair, so it's more accurate to say we." Rachel placed her purse on the table, sat on the visitor's couch, gesturing for him to sit next to her. "I've thought about your proposal," Rachel calmly began. "In principle, I agree, but I have a few questions and conditions." "You're amazing for deciding after all," Mr. Morris exclaimed enthusiastically. "I want the wedding to be modest, just the closest ones," Rachel continued. "Why modest?" The man was surprised. "I thought we'd throw a big celebration. After all, it's my only son getting married." "We're not getting married for love, so a modest wedding is enough," Rachel explained. "We'll each live in our own place." "That's where I strongly disagree," Mr. Morris interrupted her. "You have to reform him, instill family values." "How will you do that from a distance?" "Okay, then where do you suggest we live?" "With us, of course. We have a big house, there's enough space for everyone," the man replied firmly. "Okay," the girl reluctantly agreed. "Having children is out of the question." "Well, it'll happen if it happens," Mr. Morris chuckled. "It's such an unpredictable thing." "I'm not going to sleep with your son," Rachel said indignantly. "We didn't agree on that." "Well, we haven't agreed on anything yet, but it's understood for married people," Mr. Morris replied. "So, we'll be an exception," said Rachel. "I won't drag you into bed with him," Mr. Morris reassured her. "After the wedding, you two can decide." "Anything else?" "If I'll be managing equally with you, will I get more salary?" Rachel asked nonchalantly. "Of course," the man confirmed. "Not 50-50, of course, but I'm willing to contribute 40% to your family budget." "What do you mean by that?" Rachel was surprised. "We'll have separate budgets with Dennis, especially since he doesn't work." "Well, I'll deal with that. He'll start working," Mr. Morris promised. "All right then," Rachel concluded her demands. "Does Dennis know about the upcoming wedding?" "Not yet, but he'll find out today," Mr. Morris said enthusiastically, anticipating his son's reaction. "And if he doesn't agree?" Rachel asked. "Naturally, he'll refuse," Mr. Morris smiled. "But his opinion doesn't matter anymore." "Well, you won't force him into marriage." Rachel was puzzled. For a moment, she thought that this whole plan might fail. "Oh, Rachel, don't worry, I have other, more intelligent methods." The man got up and left for home. "Get ready to meet tomorrow and warn your mom," he instructed. "Okay," Rachel nodded. Mr. Morris returned home in a wonderful mood, confident that nothing and no one could change it. "Where's my beloved family?" he called out loudly. "Why are you making so much noise?" His wife came out to meet him. "And why are you so happy?" "I'm in a wonderful mood, and I have terrific news." He hugged his wife, took her hand, and led her to the living room. "Where's Dennis?" he asked. "At home, I'll call him," Mrs. Morris said cautiously and went to fetch her son. 2 minutes later, she returned, followed by Dennis. "Hi, Dad," the boy greeted. "What's your news?" "Sit down," he seated them on the couch. "A celebration has come to our house." Mrs. Morris and Dennis exchanged glances and continued to listen to the head of the family. "So, in our family, there will soon be a wedding," Arnold joyfully announced. "We need to start preparing." "What wedding?" Mrs. Morris didn't understand. "Our Dennis is getting married." The man looked at his son's reaction. He sat calmly, his face paled, and he lost his speech. "Are you joking?" His wife was outraged. "What wedding?" "Dennis, are you getting married?" The young man sat motionless, staring blankly ahead. "Dennis, can you hear me?" His mother started shaking him. "Did you forget to tell me about the wedding?" "Mom, I don't understand," the boy barely managed to speak. "Let him come to his senses," Mr. Morris interrupted his wife and sat next to his son. "Can't you see, the boy is speechless with joy?" "Are you laughing?" Mrs. Morris sniffled and took out a handkerchief to wipe away her tears. "Why do I always find out everything at the last moment? And who's the bride? Ah, finally that question. The man was very pleased with his scheme. And the bride is Rachel. Rachel? His wife was surprised. I've never heard Dennis mention anyone named Rachel. Rachel, who works for me, Mr. Morris declared. What? Mrs. Morris was amazed. That upstart? I would appreciate it if you'd speak more respectfully about your future daughter-in-law, the man requested. He'll never marry her. Mrs. Morris began to shout. Son, why are you silent? Or are you okay with everything? Mom, please leave, Dennis spoke up. I need to talk to Dad. I'm not going anywhere, the woman resisted. Mom. Dennis raised his voice. I'm asking you. Mrs. Morris huffed at her son and left. What did I do to deserve you deciding to marry me off to your employee? Dennis asked calmly. That's the thing, you do nothing, you're wasting your life, his father replied. I'll get my act together, I'll change, the son began to promise. I don't believe your promises anymore. You've told me that 100 times already. Dad, I don't want to get married, and I won't, Dennis declared. And where will you go? Mr. Morris smirked. If you don't marry Rachel, then I'll cut you off completely, understood? Understood, Dennis nodded. It's cruel of you, I didn't expect this. And I didn't expect to have such an irresponsible, uninitiated, arrogant, lazy egoist for a son. What a high opinion you have of me, Dennis was offended. I'm just stating the truth, one doesn't get offended by the truth. You don't know me at all. You're always at work, Dennis's face instantly turned sad. I can count on one hand how many times you've been at my birthdays. You don't know who my friends are, but you know all the cities in the world. Convenient, right, Dad? To wait until your son grows up and only then remember he exists. And what have you been living on all this time? The father raised his voice. What bought this house, your car, and much more? I needed a father, not a wallet, Dennis said bitterly. You'll get married, and that's final. Mr. Morris shouted. Understood? Yes, I've understood everything for a long time, Dennis stood up. I'll get married. Maybe after that, you'll start to notice me. Dennis looked into his father's eyes. He wanted him to see and understand that he was wrong, but it didn't happen. Go on, get ready for tomorrow's meeting, Mr. Morris ordered in a commanding tone. Dennis left the living room, and Mrs. Morris entered. She had been standing behind the door and had heard their entire conversation. You know, Arnie, the woman calmly began, I've always tried to support you, but you're wrong now. It's your fault that he turned out this way, the man said harshly. It's not my fault. I'm a mother, which means I should always be there. But where were you all his childhood, and generally always? Ungrateful, he shouted after his departing wife. The next day, Mr. Morris came to work, and Rachel was already in the office. Tonight, you and Mom come to dinner at our place at 7, he said, entering his office. Rachel immediately understood that yesterday's family conversation had not gone well, but since they were invited to dinner, it meant the wedding was on. The whole day passed productively, quickly, you could say, it flew by. There were many clients, and Rachel didn't have time to fill her head with unnecessary thoughts. Mr. Morris left his office in the evening. I'm going home. We'll expect you at 7, he said casually, as if he were doing them a favor. Exactly at 7 in the evening, Rachel and her mother stood at the front door of Mr. Morris's house. Welcome, he opened the door already in a good mood and invited them in. Dinner passed easily and casually. Mrs. Morris found a common language with the future mother-in-law, but she still treated Rachel coldly. Dennis was practically silent all evening, occasionally responding with agreement to everything. So it's decided. The wedding will be in a week, Mr. Morris summed up. I'll take care of everything. Thank you for your care and for the wonderful evening, Mrs. Spencer thanked. We'll start preparing for the wedding. I'll cover all expenses, the man declared, so choose a dress, I'll pay for it. Thank you, Rachel said gratefully. Dennis, escort the ladies out, Mr. Morris requested. Yes, sir. Dennis bowed demonstratively to his father. Enough fooling around, the latter chuckled. Go on. Are you sure you made the right decision? Mrs. Morris asked her husband when everyone had left. Absolutely. I've never been so sure of anything, Mr. Morris affirmed. Dennis escorted the ladies to the exit, opened the door for them. Goodbye, Dennis, Mrs. Spencer said goodbye and stepped aside from the kids so as not to disturb them. Dennis, Rachel decided to talk. I see that this wedding is a burden for you, but Mr. Morris is confident it will benefit you. Do you always follow someone else's opinion? The guy smirked. Don't you have your own? I have everything I need. I just fully agree with him on this issue. Goodbye, future wife, Rachel teased Dennis. But I can't promise that the future will be happy. Rachel wanted to retort, but he slammed the door right in her face. Get used to it, her mother said in annoyance. There won't be any other attitude toward you, at least for the time being. It's okay, we'll get through this, Rachel said spiritedly. A week later, the wedding ceremony took place. Rachel was in a snowy white dress. She looked fantastic, everyone noticed it. Dennis, on the other hand, wore a strict black suit. Despite his parents' dissuasion from black, suggesting dark blue instead, the guy insisted on it, saying that for him, it wasn't a celebration but rather the funeral of his freedom. His parents didn't insist, deciding it would be easier this way. After the marriage, everyone went to a restaurant where a table had been booked in advance, and the menu had been discussed. My dear children, Mr. Morris began his toast, I am very happy that you got married, so to speak, created a new unit of society. I wish you all the happiness and prosperity from the bottom of my heart. So let's drink to that, Dennis interrupted and downed a glass of champagne in one gulp. You shouldn't drink so much alcohol, his mother whispered, you'll get drunk quickly. What's wrong with that? Dennis asked, surprised. Maybe I want to get drunk so I don't have to see this farce sober. Son, stop talking nonsense, Mrs. Morris tried to reason with him. Behave yourself properly. By the way, about gifts, Arnold decided to continue. We decided to give you a honeymoon trip to the city of love. To Venice? Rachel asked, admiringly. That's why I love you, for your knowledge of your business and resourcefulness, the man smiled. And how long are we going there? Dennis asked gloomily. For 10 days, Mrs. Morris announced. Plus, we're giving you a card with a decent balance. Don't deny yourselves anything. Don't worry, we won't, Dennis replied carelessly. And I never doubted you, Mr. Morris began to sound annoyed, judging by his tone. Thank you very much for the gift, Rachel thanked and kissed her father-in-law and mother-in-law. Now it's my turn to congratulate, Mrs. Spencer said shyly. I hope this marriage will eventually be happy, that you'll understand each other and learn to listen and hear each other, and that love will appear in your family. Nice toast, Mr. Morris praised. To the newlyweds. Rachel didn't expect such a turn of events, and she felt uneasy. Dennis silently got up, approached his wife, and kissed her passionately on her soft lips. Rachel couldn't resist and responded to the kiss. Maybe something good will come out of this, Mrs. Morris commented quietly. A week later, Rachel and Dennis flew to Venice. There, with the help of alcohol, they more or less found a common language, went on excursions, and enthusiastically discussed them afterward. They also visited medieval palaces, walked through the most famous places in Venice, and a couple of times they had romantic evenings with gondola rides and dinners in local restaurants. On the last evening, they decided to order dinner in their room. Not a bad vacation, Dennis stood by the window with a glass of wine. And you're pretty cool. Well, you're not bad yourself, Rachel approached him and clinked glasses. To us. To us, Dennis smiled and kissed Rachel. The girl felt his passionate lips. Inside her arose an irresistible desire. Dennis felt her desire on a fluid level. It was mutual. He touched her waist with his hand and slowly moved it along her back. Rachel pressed closer to him. Dennis took her glass and placed it on the table next to his own. Rachel stood frozen, unable to move. The young man looked at her with the gaze of a predator before the jump and, approaching her, took her in his arms and carried her into the bedroom. The next morning, Rachel woke up and realized what had happened. She looked at her husband, who was peacefully sleeping. He seemed so cute and vulnerable to her. She hugged him and fell asleep again. "Wake up quickly," Dennis woke her up 3 hours later, "or we'll be late for the plane." "What?" exclaimed Rachel, looked at the clock, and gasped. They flew home in silence, as if nothing had happened. Upon arrival, they found out that Mr. Morris was in the hospital. "Why didn't you tell me anything on the phone?" Dennis asked his mother. "Son, nothing is known for sure yet. I didn't want to worry you," Mrs. Morris justified herself. "You should have told me." He raised his voice at his mother and left, slamming the door. "It's my fault," the woman said sadly. "Don't blame yourself. You wanted what's best," Rachel supported her. "Thank you for your support, but in the future, please don't interfere in my relationship with my son," Mrs. Morris said to her and left. Rachel stood in confusion and bewilderment. What could she have done to deserve such treatment? So she decided that she just got caught in the crossfire of her mother-in-law's anger. "Rachel, will you go see father?" Dennis peeked in. Yes, of course. The girl really wanted to visit Mr. Morris. An hour later, they were already standing outside the ward, talking to the attending physician. "Doctor, what's wrong with him?" Dennis was worried. "And how serious is it?" "I won't lie. It's more serious than we thought," the doctor replied. "And is there no hope?" Rachel asked anxiously. "There's always hope," the doctor reassured. "Excuse me, but I need to go to surgery." Dennis and Rachel entered the ward and saw the helpless father. "How are you?" Son took his hand. "Well, there have been better days," Arnold joked. "If you're joking, it means you're getting better," Rachel smiled. "I wish I could believe that," Mr. Morris sighed. They talked for 30 minutes. The young couple talked about their trip, and the father just listened, occasionally making admiring remarks. "Mr. Morris, it's time to rest," the nurse entered the room. "I'm sorry, they will leave soon, we'll talk a little more," the man said quietly. "Okay, but not for long." The nurse left. "Rachel, could you leave us alone?" the father asked. "Of course." Rachel quietly left the room. "Son, don't leave her," he grasped his son's hand, "be there for her." "Dad, you're talking as if you're saying goodbye." "Stop it. Promise me." The father pleaded. "I can't promise you that," Dennis said dejectedly. "I'm sorry." "Too bad," the father let go of his hand. "Bring me Rachel." Dennis kissed his father and left the room. "Go, he's calling you," he addressed Rachel. Rachel quietly entered the room. "Did you call me?" She clarified. "Yes, sit down, I have something to tell you." They talked for only 2 minutes, after which Rachel put some paper into her purse and left. "So, what did he say to you?" Dennis asked. "Nothing special, just asked me to be there for you." 5 days later, Mr. Morris passed away. Their house was filled with mourning and grief. Mrs. Morris cried all the time. Mrs. Spencer comforted her, as she perfectly understood her feelings. Dennis walked around mournfully and gloomily, and Rachel tried to support everyone, although she herself felt desperate. A month after the funeral, Dennis came to Rachel's office. "Let's get divorced," he suggested. "Why? Are you unhappy with me? Our marriage was originally fake, so there's no point in breaking the charade now." "But what if I don't want to?" Rachel tried to resist the divorce. "But I do," Dennis firmly decided. "Is this your final decision?" Rachel clarified. "And you won't change your mind?" I've made up my mind, the guy confirmed. Fine, I agree, Rachel consented. I hope you won't claim any property from me. We had nothing when we were married. Don't worry, Rachel reassured him. And a month later, the divorce process took place. Rachel didn't claim anything. Why didn't you tell him anything? Her mother asked after the divorce. It's better this way, Rachel whispered. And why are you so proud? Her mother wondered. Because of you, Rachel sighed. For a whole week after the divorce, Rachel continued working at the agency. She sat, looking at the upcoming departure dates for regular clients, when suddenly the door opened and her mother-in-law entered the office with some unknown man. Hello, Rachel, her mother-in-law greeted her. Good afternoon, Rachel politely replied. Meet Mr. Willis, he's a notary, Mrs. Morris introduced the man. Nice to meet you, said Rachel. So, what's the matter? Mr. Willis has prepared a document. You need to sign it, Mrs. Morris handed the paper to the girl. Rachel started reading the text, and with each word, she understood less of its content. But I didn't claim anything. Why this paper? You see, the man began to speak, after a divorce, you can still claim property. It's important to meet certain time frames. Mrs. Morris decided to play it safe and asked me to draw up a renunciation of everything they own. All you need to do is sign, and everyone will sleep soundly. So you don't trust me, Rachel got angry. Of course not. Who are you to trust? The woman said indignantly. You're just my son's ex-wife. Tell me honestly, are you going to sell the travel agency? Rachel asked. Of course. Why do I need this burden? The woman smirked. How can you call his life's work a burden? Rachel was in shock. Enough. The woman shouted. You're not the one to teach me. God knows, I didn't want this, but apparently, there's no other way. Rachel took out her bag and started opening it. What else have you come up with? Mrs. Morris was angry. Sign, I'm telling you. Rachel smiled and pulled out a paper from her bag. Do you know what this is? She waved it in front of them. Let me see, Mr. Willis reached out his hand. Rachel handed him the document, he quickly read it. It's a will. What will? Mrs. Morris was stunned. For what? I understand it's for this travel agency. Yes, that's right. Your husband has made a will in favor of Rachel Morris, so there's no disputing it now. Can't we contest the will? The woman asked hopefully. In principle, yes, but Rachel doesn't claim anything else except this agency. The notary looked at Rachel questioningly. No, Rachel shook her head. Well then, give her the agency, and the rest will stay with you and your son, the notary continued. Tear up the will, demanded Mrs. Morris. What do you mean? The notary didn't understand. Literally. Tear it up, or I'll tear it up myself, the woman started threatening. I can't do that. It's a legal document, and I'm a notary. You're pushing me towards a criminal offense. Do you understand that? And in the presence of a witness. I don't care, Mrs. Morris shouted and tried to snatch the document from the notary, but he didn't lose his composure and handed it to Rachel. Thank you, the girl thanked him. I'm paying you. The woman was outraged. You're paying me for the services of a notary, not for criminal activities. Goodbye. With these words, Mr. Willis left. Well, why are you looking at me like that? Mrs. Morris said disdainfully. You got what you wanted, you snatched the agency. Damn it all. The woman quickly left the office, and Rachel cried for a long time. Inside her, she felt as if she had been covered in mud. 2 months passed. Rachel successfully managed her agency, although she had to hire an assistant to occasionally take breaks, as she had been feeling unwell lately. Mrs. Morris no longer appeared in her life, just like Dennis. Rachel, her mother said, you should take more breaks, you can't overwork yourself in your condition. Mom, I understand everything, but I need to work. And are you going to give birth at work too? Mrs. Spencer protested. Don't talk nonsense, Rachel pleaded. Maybe you should still tell Dennis about the baby? Mrs. Spencer still hoped for her daughter's prudence. Why? He doesn't need it. How do you know? Sooner or later, he'll find out anyway. Whatever will be, Rachel calmly replied. A year later, Rachel gave birth to a strong, healthy boy. He was the spitting image of his grandfather. He looked so much like Mr. Morris. Mrs. Spencer was amazed. Now tell Dennis about the child. Mom, let's close this topic once and for all, Rachel asked, but her mother fell silent in response. 6 months later, Rachel was walking in the park with her child. The weather was sunny and warm. The baby took his first hesitant steps, delighting his young mother. Come to me, my dear, Rachel reached out to her son, and the boy, wobbling, walked into her arms. They headed home from the park when Rachel noticed Mrs. Morris with Dennis from a distance. They were walking quite fast and looking around, as if searching for someone. Rachel decided not to bump into them and, turning around, headed in the opposite direction. Rachel! Dennis's loud cry rang out. The girl turned around and saw him running after her. She quickened her pace, but couldn't get away. Hi, he looked at her bewilderedly, tears in his eyes, then looked at the boy and, squatting down, quietly cried. Hello, Rachel, Mrs. Morris approached them. She couldn't take her eyes off the child. Forgive me for everything, if you can. I forgave you a long time ago, Rachel said calmly. Allow me to be a part of your life. Dennis calmed down and stood up. But you didn't need me, Rachel smiled. Not true, Mrs. Morris cried. Dennis talks about you all the time and wanted to get you back many times, but I didn't let him do it. Did you tie him down, or does he have no opinion of his own? Forgive me, the woman apologized again. I told him that you have someone else. I'm guilty before you. I can't give you an exact answer right now, Rachel looked at Dennis, but we can try. After all, he's your son too. Rachel put the boy on the ground, stepped back, squatted down, and reached out to him. He looks so much like Arnold, Mrs. Morris said with fondness. And what's his name? Dennis asked. Rachel looked at them, smiled, reached out to her son again, and called him. Arnold, sweetheart, come to mommy.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.